The morning Caleb Voss dragged his 6-year-old daughter through the doors of Harlan's general store, he wasn't prepared for what he was about to witness, and neither was anyone else in Coldwater Flats. Lily clutched the back of his coat with both fists, her boots leaving small, uneven prints in the mud tracked across the floorboards. Her dress was the same one she'd worn 3 days running, a faded blue cotton thing with a torn hem and a missing button at the collar. Her hair hadn't seen a comb in longer than Caleb cared to admit. He was reaching for a sack of flour when he heard it. "Lord have mercy," Ruth Hensley's voice carried from the dry goods counter like a blade. She was standing with 2 other women, Mabel Croft and the banker's wife, Diane Osgood, and all 3 of them were staring directly at Lily. "Is that the Voss girl? She looks like she was raised by wolves." Mabel pressed a hand to her chest. "Someone ought to report him to the county sheriff. That child is a disgrace." Lily's grip on Caleb's coat tightened. She didn't make a sound. She had learned somewhere in the last 2 years that making sounds didn't help. Caleb stood perfectly still with his hand on the flour sack, his jaw locked. His eyes stayed forward. Every muscle in his body was coiled like a rope pulled to its breaking point, and he said absolutely nothing. Because what could a man say? That they were right? That he knew? That he looked at his daughter some mornings and felt like he was staring at a wound he didn't know how to close? He paid for the flour. He walked Lily back to the wagon. He didn't speak until they were 3 miles outside of town, the wind coming hard off the open plain, and even then all he said was, "Don't pay them any mind." Lily looked at him. Her eyes were gray like her mother's had been. "I don't," she said quietly. "I stopped a long time ago." That sentence nearly broke him in half. If you've ever watched someone you love disappear and felt powerless to stop it, not from illness, not from distance, but simply because grief had taken over and left nothing useful in its place, then you already understand something about Caleb Voss before I say another word about him. He was 34 years old and already looked 50. 6 feet of weathered working muscle with hands that had calloused over so many times they'd gone almost numb, and a face that had stopped being readable somewhere around the time they buried Margaret. He ran 900 acres of high plains grass outside Coldwater Flats, Montana, Voss land, his father's land, and his grandfather's before that. And he ran it the way a man runs something out of obligation rather than love. Because obligation was the only clean feeling he had left. Margaret had died in February, 2 winters back. A fever that started on a Tuesday and was killing her by Saturday. The doctor came out from town and stood at the foot of their bed and spoke in that low, careful voice that doctors use when they've already decided there's nothing left to do. And Caleb had stood in the hallway listening to that voice through the door, with Lily asleep against his shoulder, and felt the floor go soft beneath him. He hadn't found it solid again since. The ranch had kept running because ranches don't wait for grief to pass. The cattle needed feeding, and the fences needed mending, and the hay needed cutting and hauling, and Caleb did all of it, mechanically, relentlessly, without complaint, because work was the one thing he knew how to do that didn't require him to feel anything. He woke before dawn. He came in after dark. He ate whatever was cold and available and went to bed and did it again. Lily had learned to feed herself. She'd learned to dress herself. She'd learned to heat water on the stove for washing, to patch her own socks with the needle she found in her mother's sewing basket, to fall asleep by herself in a room that still smelled faintly of lavender and loss. She was 6 years old, and she had already learned that asking her father for things was a kind of cruelty. Not because he was a cruel man, but because she could see, in the way his face went strange and distant when she called him, that every time she needed something from him, it cost him something he didn't have. So she stopped asking. And Caleb, who was not stupid, who was not heartless, who had once sat beside Margaret and made quiet plans about the kind of father he was going to be, Caleb knew. He saw it. He watched his daughter learn to disappear, and he hated himself for allowing it. And he continued allowing it anyway, because the alternative was to open something inside himself that he was not at all certain he could close again. This is the particular hell of grief that nobody talks about plainly enough. It doesn't just hurt you. It makes you useless to the people standing right next to you. The day he put the advertisement in the Billings Weekly Courier was a Wednesday in late October. He'd spent the morning trying to rebraid a fence line that had come down in the wind, working alone in the gray cold with his fingers going stiff and his mind running in circles the way it did when he wasn't paying it proper attention. He kept coming back to the scene in Harlan's store, to Ruth Hensley's voice, to Lily's small, flat, "I stopped a long time ago." He got back to the house at midday and found Lily sitting on the kitchen floor near the stove. Not beside it exactly, but close enough to catch the edge of its warmth, with a book open on her knees that she wasn't reading. She was just sitting there, looking at nothing. A child so accustomed to silence, she'd made a kind of peace with it. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he went to the desk in the front room, found a piece of paper, and wrote the advertisement in the same plain hand he used for supply lists and breeding records. Help wanted. Housekeeper for working cattle ranch. Coldwater Flats vicinity, Montana territory. Year-round position. Private quarters. Reasonable wages. One child in household, age 6. Inquiries by post to C. Voss, Route 4. He folded it, rode back to town, and handed it across the counter at the courier office to a young man who looked at it twice like he expected something more. "That's all?" the young man said. "That's all," Caleb said. He didn't tell the boy that writing those 47 words had taken him the better part of an hour, that he'd rewritten the part about the child 3 times because he kept writing it in a way that sounded like a warning, and then telling himself it wasn't a warning, and then writing it like a warning again. He didn't say that riding back to the ranch that afternoon, he felt something that might have been relief and might have been shame. It was hard to tell anymore. The two feelings had been living so close together for so long. He received 4 replies over the following 3 weeks. The first was from a widow in Billings who wanted to know if she could bring her 2 adult sons with her. The second was from a woman who spent most of the letter explaining her baking credentials in such exhaustive detail that Caleb read it twice looking for something else and gave up. The third was from someone whose handwriting was completely illegible, and Caleb spent 20 minutes with it before concluding that either the writer had been in tremendous haste or was communicating in code. The fourth letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a seed catalog and an overdue feed bill. It was 3 paragraphs long. The handwriting was even and clear. It said, "My name is Elara Whitmore. I am 28 years of age and in good health. I have kept house since I was 14, first for my own family, then for others. I am not afraid of hard work or difficult circumstances. I don't have references from the last 2 years as I have been traveling, but I am willing to discuss the reasons for that in person if you're willing to hear them. I can be in Coldwater Flats by the 2nd week of November if you want to meet. I noticed your advertisement says there's a child. I'm good with children. I don't say that the way people say it when they mean they can tolerate children. I mean, I genuinely like them, which I know isn't always convenient. If this doesn't suit what you're looking for, no offense taken. But if it does, I'll be on the eastbound stage. E. Whitmore." Caleb read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and went back to work. That night, after Lily was in bed, he read it a 3rd time. He sat with it under the lamp for a while and thought about the word traveling and what it might be covering for. He thought about the last 2 years and the careful way she'd acknowledged not having references without apologizing for it, which struck him as either honest or calculated, and he wasn't certain which. He wrote back the next morning, short, 3 sentences. "Come on the 11th. Stage arrives at 2 in the afternoon. I'll be at the depot." He mailed it before he could think about it any further. And he almost didn't go. November 11th arrived gray and bitter, the kind of cold that comes off the mountains without any politeness, and Caleb spent most of the morning telling himself that a woman who wrote like that, clear, direct, slightly too comfortable with her own opinions, was probably going to take one look at the ranch and get back on the same stage heading west. He went anyway, left Lily with old Doris Pemberton, the nearest neighbor, who took children the way some people take in stray cats, without fuss, without enthusiasm, but with a certain fundamental competence. Rode into town, tied the horse in front of the depot, and stood on the platform with his hat in his hands, and felt faintly ridiculous. The stage was 12 minutes late. When it finally came, 3 people got off: a traveling salesman with a sample case, a young man who looked fresh from somewhere east and overwhelmed by Montana, and a woman. She was not what he'd built in his head. He'd been picturing someone older, rounder, more maternal in the obvious way. The kind of woman who looks like she was born to run a house. Elara Whitmore was slight, dark-haired, with a face that was pretty in a serious sort of way. Not the kind of pretty that announces itself, but the kind you notice after looking for a moment too long. She was carrying a single bag, a small one, and she wore a coat that had been good once and had been worn hard enough since that it showed. She looked around the platform with steady, quiet eyes that didn't linger anywhere for too long. She spotted him, or recognized him as the most likely candidate, and walked over directly. "Mr. Voss." "Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a beat of silence that could have been awkward and somehow wasn't. It was more like two people taking a reading of each other, fast and honest. "Your town is smaller than I expected," she said. "Most things out here are," he said. "The cold isn't." Something at the corner of her mouth moved slightly. "Fair enough." They rode back to the ranch in near silence. Not uncomfortable silence, just the kind that comes when two people are still deciding whether they're going to be useful to each other and neither one wants to say something premature. The wind pushed hard across the open plain, and the wagon rocked, and Caleb kept his eyes on the road, and Elara kept hers on the land moving past, and he had the distinct impression that she was noting things, filing them away behind those dark, careful eyes. "The advertisement said 1 child," she said, when they were about halfway out. "A girl. Lily. She's 6. What's she like?" He thought about it, truly thought about it, which he hadn't done recently enough. "Quiet," he finally said. "She used to be louder. She used to ask questions about everything, drove her mother half crazy with it." He stopped, rearranged something in his jaw. "She doesn't ask much anymore." A silence. "How long has her mother been gone?" 2 years, February. Elara didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. Bad. The ranch looked worse in the fading afternoon light than it did in Caleb's head, which was saying something. The house was a solid structure, 2 stories, well-built, the kind that had been put together to last. But it had the hollowed-out quality of a place that had stopped being cared for from the inside. The porch railing on the left side had come loose and was leaning inward at a tired angle. The curtains in the front window were the color of something that used to be white. The woodpile was adequate. Everything else looked like the minimum. Elara didn't flinch. She looked at it with the same quiet, appraising look she'd given the land, and then she stepped down from the wagon and followed him inside. The interior smelled of cold ash, old grease, and something underneath that might have been the memory of lavender. The kitchen was functional and almost entirely joyless. There was a fine layer of dust on most flat surfaces and dishes stacked without much organization. A child's boot was sitting in the middle of the floor for no apparent reason. Caleb picked up the boot and stood there holding it, looking at his kitchen through the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time. And he felt something that wasn't quite shame, but was close enough to it that his face went tight. "I haven't had," he started. "You don't have to explain," she said. Not unkindly, just matter of fact. She set her bag down near the door and started looking around in the specific way of someone planning, not judging. "Where does Lily sleep?" "Upstairs, first door." She nodded. "Where would my quarters be?" "Room at the end of the hall. It's small, has a window." Another nod. She was looking at the stove now, then the wood box. "The stove's cold." "I know." "I'll get a fire going." She moved toward the wood box without waiting for his direction or permission, and Caleb stood in the middle of his own kitchen holding a small boot and watched her, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the distinct and unsettling sensation of someone else taking competent charge of something. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or invaded. He stood there until it felt too strange to keep standing there, then put the boot by the door and went back out to deal with the horse. Lily came home with old Doris at supper time. She walked in the kitchen door in her coat and her good boots, the ones that still had both soles, and stopped dead when she saw the stranger at the stove. The kitchen smelled different, warm. Something was cooking that made the whole room feel about 10 degrees larger than it actually was, and the table had been cleared and the counter had been cleared, and even the dishes were stacked in a manner that implied they'd been organized by someone with a system. Lily looked at Elara. Elara looked at Lily. Caleb stood in the far corner of the kitchen, feeling roughly as useful as a fence post. You must be Lily, Elara said, not in the high, performative voice that adults often use with children, that this is how I talk to small people voice that children can smell from across a room. Just the same voice she'd used with Caleb, level, real. Lily looked at her for a long moment. Who are you? Elara Whitmore. I'm going to be keeping house for your father. Do you cook? I do. Lily looked at the stove. Is that supper? Beef stew, with biscuits, if I can find the tin. Lily pointed wordlessly at the high shelf on the left side of the hutch. Elara found the tin. Lily watched her work for a minute, then carefully took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, which was more than she usually did, Caleb noted, and sat down at the table. What's wrong with your hair? Lily said. Elara looked over. Her hair had come partly loose from its knot during the cooking, which Caleb had noticed and not mentioned because he had no idea what to do with that information. The wind got into it, she said. Mama used to do hers with 2 pins and it never came loose. Your mama sounds like she had better pins than I do. Lily thought about this with great seriousness. She had a tortoiseshell set, she said. They're still in her room. Something moved across Elara's face. Fast, controlled, private. Then she knew what she was doing, she said, and went back to the stew. And somehow the particular way she said that, without drama, without treading carefully around the word she, the way some adults did, as though the ghost of a dead woman was a conversational landmine, made Lily sit a little straighter. Caleb watched his daughter from across the kitchen and felt the specific quiet ache of a man watching something he should have been doing himself. Supper was the first meal in 2 years that had been cooked by someone who intended it to taste like something. Caleb was not a man who cared much about food. He had gotten to the point where eating was mostly maintenance. But he sat across the table from his daughter and the woman who'd been in his house for less than 4 hours, and the biscuits were warm and the stew was thick with something he couldn't immediately identify, but suspected was rosemary, and he ate 2 bowls without noticing he'd done it. Lily ate everything on her plate and looked at the pot. You can have more, Elara said. I know, Lily said, already getting up. It was the most animated Caleb had seen her in months, and it was over a bowl of stew, and he didn't know what to do with that fact except file it somewhere painful. After supper, Elara washed up while Caleb sat at the table with his second cup of coffee and reviewed the terms of the arrangement. Wages, days off, what was expected, what wasn't. She listened carefully and asked 2 specific questions about the days off, which told him she was either planning something or had a life he didn't know about yet. He didn't ask. She didn't volunteer. When Lily's bedtime came, Elara offered to take her up. Caleb almost said no. It was the kind of thing that lived on the boundary between relief and relinquishment. But Lily had already looked at Elara and then looked at him with a reading he couldn't quite parse. And he said, If you want, and the 2 of them went upstairs. He sat alone in the kitchen and listened to the sounds from above. Lily's voice, asking something. Elara's voice, answering. A pause. Lily's voice again, longer this time, which meant she was telling something, explaining something, because Lily only used that many words when she had something specific to convey. The floor creaking as someone moved. A door closing. Elara came back down 10 minutes later and sat across from him and poured herself the last of the coffee like she'd lived in the house for years. He looked at her. What did she say? He asked. He hadn't meant to ask it. It came out before he caught it. Elara thought about it for a moment. She told me where her mother's pins are, she said. And she told me the stove makes a sound at night that used to scare her, but she's used to it now. Caleb looked at his coffee cup. She never told me that, he said, about the sound. She thought you'd be embarrassed for her. He sat with that for a long time. She's going to be all right, Elara said. It wasn't a comfort, exactly. It was too plain and matter-of-fact for that. It was more like information. Children are harder than people think. They adapt, but they need someone paying attention. She said it without inflection, without pointing it at him specifically, but it landed exactly where it was aimed. He felt it in his sternum, the way you feel a pulled thread, a small, distinct tension that comes from something being pulled back into place. He looked at her across the table and said, I know. And she nodded, once, as if that was enough for tonight, and finished her coffee and went upstairs to her room at the end of the hall. Oh. The first week was like learning the grammar of a new language. Elara worked without announcement or interruption. She moved through the house in a quiet, organized way that wasn't intrusive but that changed everything it touched. The kitchen reorganized itself. Clean laundry appeared on the beds. The curtains came down and got washed and went back up looking like something that had been recently manufactured. The porch railing still leaned, but that was a repair job, not a cleaning job. But the boards beneath it got swept and scrubbed until the grain came back up. She didn't ask Caleb for guidance. She asked him for supplies, like lye soap, salt, a new brush for the stove, and she was specific about quantities in a way that told him she'd done this long enough to know exactly what she needed. He brought things from town. She used them. The house changed. He watched it the way you watch a season turn. Not in a single day, not dramatically, but through accumulation, through small shifts that add up to something large. The thing he hadn't expected was Lily. He had told himself the arrangement was practical. He needed someone to keep the house, and Lily needed, well, he'd avoided specifying what Lily needed because it required him to confront how thoroughly he had failed to provide it. But he told himself the important thing was that someone would be there, that the house would function, that Lily would be fed and clothed and looked after. He had not prepared for what it looked like when someone looked after Lily with actual attention. By the third day, Lily had started following Elara, not clingily, not the way a lonely child sometimes attaches with the desperation of starvation, but with a quiet, observant curiosity, the way she used to follow her mother around the kitchen, asking questions about everything. She watched Elara make bread and asked how you knew when it was ready to come out. She watched Elara mend a torn pillowcase and announced that she'd tried to sew her own sock once and the needle had gone through the wrong part, and would Elara show her the right part? Elara showed her. She sat beside Lily at the kitchen table and guided her hands and said things like, "Not that tight," and "Now pull straight through," without the exaggerated patience that people sometimes perform when they're doing something they find tiresome. She spoke to Lily like someone who found the needle and thread problem genuinely worth solving. Caleb found himself standing in doorways more than was practical, watching this. On the fifth day, he came in from the cattle pens at mid-morning to find Lily sitting on the kitchen floor with Elara's coat in her lap, carefully working a loose button back onto its threads, with her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. Elara was at the counter mixing something for the midday meal. "She lost it in the wind coming back from the well," Lily said, without looking up. "I'm fixing it." Caleb looked at his daughter's bent head, at the needle working through the fabric, at the steady little hands. "All right," he said. He went back outside. He stood on the porch for a moment in the cold, not going anywhere, just standing there with his hands at his sides. Something was moving around in his chest that he didn't have clean language for. Not exactly grief, not exactly relief. Something between the two, with an edge on it like a new fence wire, the kind that's still bright before the weather gets to it. He went back to the cattle pens. He did the work, but he carried that image with him the rest of the day. Lily's head bent over the button, the needle working through, the private expression of a child who had found something useful to do. And it felt like the first real thing he'd held in 2 years. The problem arrived on the 9th day in the form of a letter from his brother. Wade Voss lived in Cheyenne and managed a freight operation and wrote letters about 4 times a year, all of them containing opinions Caleb hadn't asked for. This one arrived on a Saturday, and Caleb read it at the kitchen table while Elara was upstairs and Lily was outside. He read it twice to make sure he'd understood it. Wade had somehow heard Coldwater Flats was a small town, and small towns talked the way they breathed, continuously and without much deliberate intent, that Caleb had hired a housekeeper. A young woman, Wade had been told. From out of state. No clear history. Moving into the house. The letter was long and covered most of a full page, and its essential message was this: "Are you out of your mind? Think about the girl. Think about what people will say. A woman like that, living under your roof, no husband, no references. Do you even know what you're bringing into that house?" Caleb set the letter down. He looked at it. He looked at the kitchen, which smelled of soap and warmth and something Elara was going to bake later, and which looked more like a room where people lived than it had in 2 years. He looked at the empty doorway where he'd watched Lily mend the button. He picked up the letter and put it in the stove. He didn't write back. He'd spent too much of his life explaining himself to his brother, and it had never once changed anything, and he didn't have the patience for it today. But the letter left something behind, even after the paper was gone, a small, cold doubt that settled in a corner of his thinking and wouldn't fully clear. Not about Elara, specifically. About himself. About his own judgment, which had failed him in other ways before. About what he was doing exactly, and whether practical was really all it was. He pushed it away. He had cattle to move. What? The thing that surprised him most about Elara Whitmore, and this took him most of the first 2 weeks to identify because it was not a quality that announced itself, was that she didn't pretend. Most people, when they came into a situation like his, performed something. They performed sympathy or cheer or a kind of deliberate normalcy. The brisk, busy energy of someone working hard to smooth over the rough patches, to act like everything was fine because they wanted everything to be fine or because they didn't know what to do with it if it wasn't. Even the kind ones performed their kindness. You could see the effort in it. Elara didn't perform anything. When things were hard, she didn't paste a smile over them. When Lily asked questions about her mother, which she did, in small, sudden moments that seemed to arrive without warning, Elara answered them directly, without flinching, without redirecting. When Caleb came in from the cattle pens smelling of cold and manure and sat at the table without saying a word, she didn't fill the silence with conversation. She put coffee in front of him and went about her own business and let the quiet be quiet. It was a particular kind of respect, and he didn't have a name for it at first, and then one evening it came to him plainly. She treated him like an adult, like a person with a full set of interior faculties who was capable of handling his own life, even when he was doing it badly. That was rarer than it should have been. He was in the barn on the 14th day, working on a harness that had come undone in the worst possible spot, when he heard footsteps and looked up to find Elara in the doorway. She was wearing her coat and her second pair of boots and carrying a lantern because the light was already going at 4 in the afternoon. "Lily's coughing," she said. "Started about an hour ago. I've got her in bed with the extra quilt. I think it's just cold air. She was outside too long this morning, but I wanted you to know." He set down the harness. "How bad?" "Not bad. Low grade, dry cough, no fever. She's a little miserable, which is appropriate." He almost smiled. "What does she need?" "Warmer socks, honey in her tea, someone to read to her for a while." A small pause. "She asked if you would." He felt his hands go still. "She asked for me?" Elara met his eyes. Her face was, as always, composed, not cold, but even. "She asked if you would read to her. I said I'd ask." He put down the harness and went to the house. Lily was in bed under the extra quilt with her nose pink and her expression carrying the specific put-upon dignity of a small person who is under the weather and knows it and has mixed feelings about the extra attention. He sat on the edge of her bed and she handed him the book she'd chosen without explanation. A collection of folk tales that was missing its cover, that had been his wife's and Lily's mother's before that. And he opened it and read. He read for half an hour. Lily fell asleep before the end of the second story, and he sat there in the dim room for a few minutes after, listening to her breathe, holding the book on his knee. When he came back downstairs, Elara was at the table with her mending. She didn't look up. "Thank you," he said, "for telling him Lily had asked, for delivering the message without editorializing around it." "She just needed to know she could ask," Elara said, still not looking up. He went to bed that night with something sitting in the back of his mind that took him a long time to fall asleep around. Not troubling, exactly. More like a stone that had shifted. Still heavy, still solid, but in a slightly different position than before. He couldn't tell yet whether that was better or worse. He was starting to suspect it might be both. The stone that had shifted in Caleb's chest the night he read to Lily did not shift back. He noticed it the way you notice a fence post that's been reset. Not dramatic, not announcing itself, but there when you looked, sitting at a slightly different angle than before. He couldn't decide if it was progress or complication, so he did what he'd done with most feelings over the past 2 years. He went to work and tried not to think about it. December came in cold and immediate, the kind of cold that Montana produces without apology, that sets into the ground by the first week and doesn't discuss leaving until April. Caleb moved the cattle closer to the shelter pastures, checked water troughs twice a day for ice, and spent long hours in the barn mending the things that had been quietly breaking all autumn while he hadn't been paying attention. There was always more broken than he'd accounted for. That was the thing about neglect. It was patient. It accumulated in silence and presented itself all at once. He thought about that more than was probably useful. Inside the house, Elara had finished what Caleb privately thought of as the first phase of her reorganization, the cleaning, the sorting, the establishing of basic order, and had moved into something harder to name, a kind of maintenance that was less about surfaces and more about atmosphere. The kitchen smelled like something good at almost every hour of the day. Clean laundry appeared with a reliability that Caleb had forgotten could be normal. Small things were repaired and put back where they belonged, and he kept almost not noticing it, and then noticing it anyway, the way you eventually notice a sound that's been missing when it finally comes back. Lily had started talking again. Not to him, not at first, but he could hear her from across rooms, asking Elara things, explaining things, narrating her small interior life in the running, slightly breathless way of a child who had stored up language for a long time and was finally finding somewhere to put it. She talked about the cattle by names she'd assigned them without telling anyone. She talked about a bird she'd been watching from the kitchen window that she was certain was building a nest in the wrong season. She talked about her mother, not always with sadness, sometimes just with the matter-of-fact recall of someone describing a person they had known well. Caleb heard those parts through walls and doorways and did not interrupt them. He wasn't sure he could have spoken around the thing in his throat if he'd tried. One evening in the second week of December, he came in from the barn later than usual. A calf had gotten into trouble, and the trouble had taken 3 hours to resolve, and he was cold to the bone and tired in the particular way that lives below the muscles, and found the kitchen empty and warm, supper covered on the stove, and a note on the table in Elara's even hand. Lily went to bed at 8, supper's on the back burner, the fire's banked, add a log before you sleep. He stood in the kitchen reading the note for longer than it took to read it. It was such a small thing. A note. Instructions. The kind of thing you leave for another person when you're functioning in the same household and want to make sure the information transfers cleanly. There was nothing in it that could be called anything more than practical. He didn't know why it hit him the way it did, somewhere between the sternum and the throat, without warning, in the way that small things sometimes do when you've been holding something large and heavy for long enough. He sat down at the kitchen table and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and stayed like that for a moment, not crying. He hadn't cried since the funeral, and he wasn't going to start now over a note, but needing a second before he could continue. He ate supper. He added a log to the fire. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time thinking about the particular quality of being looked after. Not cared for in any complicated sense, just looked after, in the basic practical way of someone thinking ahead on your behalf. And how long it had been since he'd had that, and how he hadn't understood until now how much the absence of it had ground him down. He did not arrive at any conclusions. He went to sleep. The thing about Elara was that she was not an easy person to know. Caleb recognized this slowly, the way you recognize a complicated landscape, piece by piece, with the understanding that what you've seen so far doesn't represent the whole of it. She was capable and direct, and in many small ways kind, but she kept herself at a particular distance that wasn't coldness exactly, more like the careful management of exposure. She answered questions about herself in the shortest complete sentences that still technically constituted an answer. She didn't volunteer stories. She didn't talk about where she'd come from, or who she'd left, or why she'd been traveling for 2 years with a single bag and the quality of someone who had learned not to put down roots too quickly. He didn't push. He wasn't sure he had the standing to push, and more than that, he understood it. He had his own walls, and they were not subtle, and he'd never had much patience for people who treated the walls of others as puzzles to be solved on their behalf. But there were moments. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-December, Lily had fallen asleep on the parlor floor in a patch of weak winter sunlight. She did this sometimes, the way children can fall suddenly asleep almost anywhere when their body decides it's time. And Caleb was at the table with the ranch accounts, and Elara was by the window with her mending, and it was one of those stretches of afternoon quiet that has an odd, suspended quality to it, like something paused. "You grew up on a ranch?" he said. He hadn't planned to say anything. She considered the question the way she considered most things, with a brief internal pause that was never evasive but never careless either. "No, town, western Kansas, small one. Family?" "Older brother. Parents." She turned a sock inside out and looked for the hole. "My father worked at the grain mill. My mother kept house and took in other people's laundry." "And you left?" She found the hole in the sock. "I left." He waited a moment to see if she was going to add anything. She didn't. He went back to the accounts. 4 or 5 minutes passed. "I was married," she said. She said it without preamble, in the same tone she used to say she was going to town for flour, a plain announcement of a plain fact. He looked up. She was still looking at the sock. "For about 14 months, she said, "it became clear after a while that he thought married meant something different than I thought it did." A pause. "I left when the different thing he thought it meant gave me a reason I could show a judge." She said the last part quietly and cleanly, without any drama, without any bid for sympathy. She said it the way you say something that you've processed enough to report on without it unraveling you, which told him both that it had been severe enough to leave and that she'd had long enough since to find level ground about it. "I'm sorry," he said. He meant it simply, and it came out simply. "It was 2 years ago," she said. "I've been a lot of places since. That's why you had no references. That's why I had no references." She bit the thread and set the sock down and picked up the next one. "I wasn't sure whether to put it in the letter, but I figured you'd wonder, and I'd rather tell the truth and not get the position than get it and have it come out sideways later." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm glad you put it in the letter," he said. She glanced up briefly. "Are you?" "I don't like sideways," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the kind of thing that lives in the same neighborhood as one. "No," she said. "Neither do I." They went back to their respective things, and Lily slept in the pale sunlight, and the afternoon held its suspended quality for a while longer before the light shifted and the temperature dropped and the day went ordinary again. But something had changed in the air between them, not dramatically, not in any way that declared itself, more like a room that's been slightly rearranged. You don't immediately know what moved. You just know the room is different than it was before. It was Lily who first began to sense that something was happening, which was not surprising because children in grief-quiet households develop a particular attentiveness to the emotional weather around them. They become early warning systems, finely tuned to shifts in the air because those shifts have historically mattered. She didn't say anything specific. She wasn't 7 yet and didn't have the vocabulary for what she was observing, but Caleb caught her watching him and Elara in certain moments. Not with any visible agenda, just with the careful, noting attention of someone taking inventory. One morning she said, at breakfast, to nobody in particular, "Elara doesn't leave early like Mrs. Pemberton did." Mrs. Pemberton had been a day help arrangement years back, who had left every afternoon at 4. Caleb looked at his daughter. "No," he said. "She lives here." "I know." Lily ate a piece of bread. "I like it better." He didn't know what to do with that sentence, so he drank his coffee. Later that same day, he found Lily in the barn. This was not entirely unusual. She'd always liked the barn, the smell of it, the way sound worked differently inside it. But she was sitting in the straw near the old bay mare, which was unusual, because Lily was normally careful around the horses the way her mother had taught her to be. "She's not going to bite you," he said, coming up beside her. "I know. I just wanted to sit here for a minute." She patted the mare's nose with the flat of her hand, then looked up at him. "Papa?" He lowered himself to sit on the fence rail near her. "Yeah." She thought for a moment with the serious gravity she sometimes deployed for questions that were actually complicated. "Is Elara going to stay?" He looked at her. "She's hired to stay." "I know, but is she going to stay?" The distinction she was making was not lost on him. He sat with it honestly. "I don't know," he said, Because Lily was 7 and had already been told imprecise things about imprecise situations, and he owed her better than another imprecision. I hope so. Lily turned that over. She's teaching me to make bread, she said. Proper bread, not the quick kind. I know, I smelled it. She says the dough has to rest, that you can't rush it, or it goes wrong. Lily looked at the mayor. I think that's true about a lot of things. Caleb looked at his daughter for a long moment. Where did you get that from? Elara. He didn't answer. He just sat in the barn for a little while longer than he needed to, watching the light come through the boards and thinking about all the things that couldn't be rushed and that he'd been trying to rush anyway, or possibly that he'd been refusing to approach at all, which was its own kind of force applied in the wrong direction. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, as trouble often does, when nobody has specifically prepared for it. Caleb had gone to town for winter supplies, salt, lamp oil, coal for the stove, the long, specific list that December demanded, and while he was loading the wagon in front of Harlan's, Warren Osgood came across the street to talk to him. Warren Osgood ran the bank in Coldwater Flats. He was a tall man in a good coat, with the kind of confidence that came from controlling things other people needed, and he and Caleb had a relationship of mutual tolerance that had functioned adequately for years. Osgood's wife Diane was one of the women who had been in the store the day Ruth Hensley made her comments about Lily, a fact Caleb had not forgotten. Voss, Osgood said, with the particular greeting that men use when they're about to say something they've decided to frame as a favor. Got a minute? Loading my wagon, Caleb said. Won't take long. Osgood fell in beside him anyway. Heard you've got a woman living out at the ranch. Caleb picked up a sack of salt. I hired a housekeeper. Young woman, unmarried. That's the one. He put the salt in the wagon. You know how things look, Osgood said. Small town. People talk. People do, Caleb agreed. Some of the ladies are concerned about the child, about the example being set. Osgood's voice had shifted into the register he used in the bank, the one that implied he was delivering sense from a position of experience. I'm only mentioning it because we think highly of you, Caleb. Your family's been in this county a long time. There's a certain standing to consider. Caleb put another sack in the wagon. He looked at Osgood for a moment, very level, without particular warmth. My daughter has clean clothes for the first time in 2 years, he said. She's eating 3 hot meals a day. She's learning to make bread. He picked up the last sack. The ladies can concern themselves with whatever they like. Osgood's face went through something brief. I'm only saying, Warren. Caleb turned to look at him directly. I appreciate you coming over, but I'm going home to my ranch, and Miss Whitmore is going to be there when I get back, and that's how it's going to be. He finished loading the wagon, thanked the boy who'd helped him carry things from the store, and drove out of town without looking back at Osgood standing on the street in his good coat. He was most of the way home before his hands stopped being quite so tight on the reins. He wasn't angry at Osgood, exactly. Osgood was doing what men like Osgood did, managing appearance, protecting order, delivering the consensus opinion of his wife and her friends under the cover of friendly advice. It was irritating, but it wasn't unexpected. And Caleb had grown up in this county and knew exactly how this machinery operated. What bothered him, what he turned over in his mind for the remaining miles, was the faint awareness that some part of what Osgood was saying was attempting to attach to the doubt his brother's letter had already planted. That small, cold thing in the corner of his thinking that asked what he was doing exactly and what he actually knew about the woman living in his house and whether practical could really account for all of it. He drove through the ranch gate. The house was lit from inside, warm light in the kitchen window against the flat gray of the December afternoon. He sat in the wagon for a moment before getting down. Then he got down, unhitched the horse, brought in the supplies, and didn't say anything to Elara about Warren Osgood or his wife's concerns or the talk of the town. Some things, he'd decided, were not worth bringing into the house. The afternoon he actually understood what was at stake came 8 days before Christmas. It arrived in the form of a second letter from Wade. This one was shorter and less politely framed than the first, which told Caleb his brother had been thinking about it since October and had escalated himself. The essential content was this. Wade had spoken to someone in the county. He didn't say who, which meant it was probably Osgood or someone in that circle, and had been told that people were talking, that it wasn't appropriate, a widower and a young unmarried woman alone on a ranch, that Lily's moral education was at risk, that if Caleb wouldn't make a sensible arrangement, Wade was prepared to discuss whether the current guardianship situation was really in the child's best interest. Caleb read that sentence 3 times. Then he put the letter on the desk and stood there for a long time, with his hands flat on the surface of it, staring at the wall. He knew what discuss guardianship meant coming from Wade. It was not a question. It was a lever. Wade had tried levers before, over the years in property disputes and financial arguments, and the slow, grinding disagreement about whether Caleb had been right to stay on the land after their father died instead of selling it the way Wade wanted. Wade collected leverage the way some men collected tools, carefully, with an eye toward future application. The difference between all the previous disagreements and this one was Lily. He stayed calm with the specific effort it takes to stay calm when you're not feeling calm, and he thought it through. He thought about what Wade could actually do, legally, practically. He thought about what the county's position would be and whether the arrangement at the ranch was genuinely vulnerable to any challenge. And he thought through that with more analytical precision than he'd applied to anything in recent memory, because it needed precision rather than the hot, flooding anger he was working to keep below the surface. And then he thought about Lily, about the girl who used to ask questions about everything and had gone silent for 2 years, who had started talking again, who was learning to make bread and teaching herself to sew, and had said, with the flat honesty of someone who had no reason to be dishonest about it, that she liked having Elara there better. He picked up the letter, put it in the stove with the first one, and sat down at his desk. He wrote back to Wade. The letter took him 20 minutes and was 4 sentences long. I've noted your concerns. The arrangement at the ranch is lawful and appropriate. Lily is well and in good care. I'd appreciate it if you directed any further thoughts on the subject toward something worth your time. He sealed it, put it in his coat pocket to mail the next day, and went to the kitchen. Elara was at the counter. Lily was beside her on a stool, pressing patterns into pie dough with the mouth of a cup. Both of them were dusted with flour. Lily was narrating the geometry of what she was pressing with some elaboration. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment. Neither of them heard him come in. You can't put them too close, Lily was explaining, very seriously. They have to have room. Otherwise they run together, Elara agreed, pushing a strand of hair back from her face with her wrist. Exactly. Lily pressed another circle with great authority. You have to give things room to be their own thing. Caleb leaned against the doorframe and watched his daughter give the pie dough room to be its own thing, and felt the rage from Wade's letter doing something unexpected. Not dissolving exactly, but reorienting, turning from something hot and defensive into something quieter and more certain. He knew what he was doing. Whatever Osgood said, whatever Wade threatened, whatever the women in town murmured over their sewing, he knew what he was doing, and he knew why, and it was not complicated. His daughter was alive in his kitchen, talking and learning and pressing circles into pie dough, and that was what the arrangement had produced, and nobody was going to tell him it needed to change. Elara turned and saw him in the doorway. She took in whatever was on his face, whatever he'd failed to fully smooth away, and for just a second her expression held a question. Caleb, she said, not alarmed, just noting his presence and the quality of it. Fine, he said before she asked. Good afternoon. She looked at him 1 beat longer than necessary, the way she did when she was deciding whether to press something or let it go. Then she turned back to the pie. Supper's in an hour, she said. I'll wash up, he said. He went to the washroom and stood at the basin for a long time with the cold water running over his wrists, looking at nothing, breathing slowly, getting himself back to something that resembled level ground. He understood, standing there, that he'd begun to rely on her in ways that had nothing to do with clean laundry and hot meals. That somewhere in this past month, without plan or announcement, she had become part of the way the house held itself together, and by extension part of the way he held himself together, and that was either the most natural thing in the world or the most dangerous thing he'd allowed himself in 2 years, and he did not yet know which. He dried his hands, he went to supper. Lily had flour in her hair and didn't notice. The pie was lopsided but edible. Elara was quiet, as she often was, but it was the particular quality of quiet that pays attention. Not withdrawal, but presence. After Lily went to bed, he found Elara washing up and said, without planning it, "My brother wants to contest custody of Lily. He thinks the arrangement here is inappropriate." She stopped washing. She turned to look at him. "He won't succeed," Caleb said. "I just wanted you to know, in case it causes any difficulties for you. With the way people are talking." She stood with wet hands and looked at him across the kitchen. There was something working behind her eyes. Not fear, not surprise exactly. More like someone rapidly and precisely calculating a set of variables. "Are you asking me to leave?" she said. "No." He said it without hesitation and with more force than he'd intended. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she dried her hands on the dish towel, slowly, and turned to look at the window over the sink. "When I left my husband," she said, "the thing I was most afraid of was what people would say about a woman alone. What it would mean." A pause. "I've spent 2 years learning not to care what it means to people who have no information about my actual life." She turned back to look at him. "I'm not leaving over talk, Mr. Voss." He looked at her. "Caleb," he said. She held his gaze for a beat. "Caleb," she said. And then she turned and finished the washing up, and that was all. He went to the front room and sat by the fire for a long while. Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest, the kind of wind that carried weather with it, that pressed against the windows with a certain intent. He sat with his hands around a cup of coffee, going cold, and listened to the sound of the house settling around him, the tick of the stove, the creak of a board upstairs where the temperature changed, the sound of wind finding the gaps that every old house has, and thought about what it meant to have someone in a house. Not a housekeeper, not an arrangement, someone. He didn't have clean language for what he was beginning to understand. He wasn't sure he was ready for the language yet, but something had opened in the quiet dark of that evening in the plain way she had said his name. Just that, just his name, without formality or performance, the way people say the names of people they intend to know for a long time. And it was too late to close it again, even if he'd wanted to. He wasn't sure he wanted to. The fire burned down, the wind pressed at the glass. Somewhere upstairs, Lily was asleep, and Elara was at the end of the hall in the small room with the window, and the ranch was cold and dark around them, and Caleb Voss sat in the last of the firelight and thought about all the things that couldn't be rushed, and for the first time in 2 years felt something that might, in careful language, be called the edge of hope. The wind he'd heard pressing at the glass that night was the leading edge of something larger. He knew it by morning. The sky had gone the particular shade of yellow-gray that old ranchers in Montana learned to read the way sailors read water. Not as color exactly, more as a quality, a weight in the light that means the atmosphere is building toward something and has already decided what. Caleb stood on the porch with his coffee before dawn and looked north and felt the particular stillness that precedes serious weather. The way everything goes quiet and attentive just before it stops being quiet at all. He spent the morning making the ranch as ready as he could. He moved the remaining cattle into the shelter pasture and checked that the gate latches would hold in wind. He brought extra wood onto the porch, then thought better of it and brought twice that amount into the mudroom itself, stacking it against the interior wall where it would stay dry regardless of what came. He checked the water barrels, checked the lamp oil, checked the food stores. He did all of this with the practiced efficiency of a man who had prepared for Montana winters his whole life and knew that the preparing was the difference between a hard night and a dangerous one. Elara watched him without commenting. She was her own kind of practical. She'd seen the sky too, and by the time he came in for midday, she had already moved extra blankets down from the upstairs storage, checked the coal supply for the kitchen stove, and put a large pot of beans on to cook slow. The kind of meal that could be left on low heat for hours without requiring attention. She'd also, he noticed, brought Lily's boots in from the porch and set them near the kitchen stove to warm. It was that last detail that told him she understood exactly what kind of night was coming. "How bad?" she said when he came in and washed his hands. "Don't know yet," he said. "Could be bad." She nodded and went back to the beans. Lily, for her part, was somewhere between excited and anxious in the way children are about whether they've been told is serious. drawn to the drama of it, uncertain whether to be alarmed. She kept going to windows and looking out at the sky with an expression of someone wanting to assess a thing they don't quite have the tools to assess yet. "Will the cattle be all right?" she asked at lunch. "Should be," Caleb said. "Got them in the shelter pasture." "The mare?" "In the barn." Lily absorbed this, working through her mental inventory of things worth worrying about. What about the cat? The cat in question was a half-feral gray thing that had been living in the barn for 2 years and condescended to accept food without ever accepting handling. Caleb looked at his daughter. "The cat," he said, "has been surviving Montana winters without my assistance since before you were born." Lily did not look fully reassured, but let it go. The storm hit at 4 in the afternoon. Came from the north the way the bad ones always did. Fast, without the long dramatic buildup of the milder storms, just a sudden shift in the wind's direction and intensity, and then the snow, horizontal and hard, reducing visibility to the length of an arm within 20 minutes. Caleb was in the barn when it started and spent an unpleasant 15 minutes getting back to the house against a wind that seemed personally invested in preventing it. He came in through the back door shedding snow, and Elara was there with a towel and the information that the temperature inside had already dropped 2 degrees since she'd last checked. "I banked the parlor stove," she said, "and the kitchen's going full." "Good." He shook snow off his coat. "Nobody goes outside tonight." Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd been watching through the window, and her face had resolved from excited to something more sober. The storm was loud enough now that its scale was clear even from inside. The wind was doing something to the house, a low, sustained pressure against the walls that made the whole structure register it, small creaks in the joints of old wood. "It's loud," she said. "It'll be louder," he said. "Go get your extra socks and put them on." She went. He stood in the kitchen with snow melting off him and listened to the storm establishing itself around the house, and felt the specific isolation of a ranch in a Montana blizzard. The way the world narrows to the 4 walls around you, the way everything outside ceases to be reachable, and all that exists is the heat you've managed to collect, and the people inside it with you. Oh. The first hours of the storm had their own rhythm. Caleb fed more wood into the stoves on a regular schedule, keeping the heat ahead of what the wind was pulling out through the walls. Elara made supper from what was on hand without making a project of it: the beans, cornbread, sliced salt pork, and they ate at the kitchen table while the storm hammered the house from the outside with the relentless, impersonal force of weather that has no interest in what's inconvenient. Lily ate everything and asked if she could have a candle in her room for later, in case the lamp went out. Caleb said yes, found her one, and made her show him twice that she understood not to leave it burning when she slept. After supper, Lily fell asleep on the parlor floor in front of the stove in the manner she had, which no longer surprised him. She was out between one sentence and the next, wrapped in the quilt she'd dragged downstairs, and within 2 minutes she was breathing the deep, unconcerned breath of a child who had decided that the adults had the matter in hand. Caleb carried her upstairs and put her in her bed and tucked the quilt around her. She didn't wake. He stood over her for a moment in the cold dark of the upstairs hallway, listening to the storm press at the roof, and went back down. Elara was at the kitchen table with mending she wasn't really doing. She was watching the window, which showed nothing now but solid black and the occasional hard pulse of snow against the glass. She'd made coffee and left a cup for him. He sat down across from her and picked it up. They didn't speak for a while. The storm did enough talking on its own. "Tell me about the worst winter you had here," she said eventually. He thought about it. "The winter I was 12. My father and I were out cutting fence for 3 days before a storm came up that bad. Had to shelter in a line shack for 2 nights. Didn't know until later that my mother thought we were dead." "Were you scared?" "I was 12, Yes." He looked at the window. "My father wasn't, or he didn't show it. He just kept doing the next thing that needed doing. I've been trying to figure out ever since whether that was courage or just good training." "Maybe they're the same thing," she said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "What about you? You ever been somewhere like this?" "Kansas got bad winters." She pushed the mending aside. "Different kind of cold. Flatter. Nothing between you and the sky. Worse or better?" She thought about it honestly. Different kind of frightening, she said. Here it feels like the mountain is doing something to you. In Kansas, it just felt like you didn't matter, like the whole country didn't know you existed. He understood that, though he'd never been able to put it in language. The way Montana's violence felt specific and the plains' emptiness felt indifferent. He nodded. Your husband, he said. He hadn't planned to ask. Was that in Kansas? She was quiet for a moment. Yes? He waited. I met him when I was 23, she said. He was 10 years older. He seemed certain, decided. That felt like a good quality at the time. She looked at her hands on the table. It stopped feeling that way about 4 months in, when I understood that certain just meant he decided that his version of everything was the only version, and that included what my days should look like and who I should talk to and whether what I thought about a thing was worth saying. A pause. The storm pushed hard against the north wall. It took me 10 months to understand that what he was doing had a name, she said, and another 4 to get out while he was away at a stockman's meeting in Wichita. She said it without drama, just information. I left with a bag and $17 and took the first train heading away. Caleb sat with this. He was thinking about the word out, what it took to leave, the particular fear that would make a person take a train with $17 in their pocket and no plan, choosing the unknown over what they knew. And he thought he understood something about her now that he hadn't quite assembled before. The way she was careful. The way she kept herself at a managed distance. The way she'd told him the night before that she'd spent 2 years learning not to care what things looked like to people who had no information about her actual life. She'd had to learn that. Someone had made learning it necessary. I'm sorry, he said. He'd said it once before about this, and he meant it the same way he meant it then. Simply, without decoration. It was the right train, she said. That's how I think about it now. Outside, something hit the house. A branch, or debris from somewhere. A sharp impact that made both of them look at the wall and then at each other. Just the wind finding things to throw, he said. I figured, she said, but they were both more alert after that, sitting a little straighter, listening with more of their attention. The storm was fully committed now, not building anymore, just maintaining its force with the exhausting mechanical persistence of weather that has enough weather behind it to go all night. He added more wood to the stove. She made more coffee. They sat across from each other and talked in the particular way of 2 people who have run out of small talk and moved into something more actual without quite deciding to. About his father, who had been a hard man in the way ranching sometimes made men hard, and whether Caleb had forgiven him for it or just accommodated it. About her mother, who had been quietly and completely capable and had never once in her life been asked to run anything larger than a household. About Margaret. He surprised himself by talking about her, just a little, just enough to say that she had been funny in a way that people who hadn't known her well didn't see, and that Lily's ability to make observations that landed sideways and true came directly from her mother. Elara listened to this without making it a tender moment. She just listened and asked a question or two, and let him say what he wanted to say about his wife without making it into something he had to manage. It was, he thought, the first time he'd talked about Margaret to someone who didn't immediately become careful with him afterward. Lily's fever started at 11:30. Caleb heard her before he found her. A cough from upstairs, then another, and something in the specific sound of it made him put down his coffee and go up the stairs without waiting to assess it. He knew that particular kind of cough. He knew it the way you know a sound that has already once taken something from you. She was awake when he got to her room, sitting up in bed with the quilt around her, and her face carrying the dull, confused look of a child who has just felt their body start doing something wrong. He put his hand on her forehead. Hot. Not just warm from sleeping hot, the kind of hot that sits in the palm. My head hurts, she said. Her voice was thicker than it had been at supper. I know, he said. He stood up, and his mind did 2 things at once. The part of him that was a father felt the bottom drop out of the floor, and the part of him that was responsible for keeping this child alive began, calmly and immediately, to inventory what he had and what he needed. Willow bark, cold compresses, water. He'd dealt with fevers before. Children got fevers. This was manageable. He told himself this clearly and distinctly. Then he went downstairs and Elara took one look at his face and was already moving. She didn't ask what was wrong. She went directly to the medicine box. She'd reorganized it in the first week, and he'd noted at the time that she knew what was in it, which suggested she'd had reason in the past to know what should be in a medicine box, and took out the willow bark and the bottle of fever drops and the clean cloth for compresses. "How high?" she said. "High enough." He was already at the water basin. She was fine at supper. Fevers move fast in children. Doesn't mean it's worse than it is. She filled a bowl with water and took the cloth. "Go be with her. I'll be up." He went. He sat on the edge of Lily's bed and talked to her in the low, steady voice he used for frightened cattle, and realized midway through a sentence that he was using the same voice, and that the realization didn't stop him, and that maybe it was the right voice for this regardless. Elara came up with the bowl and the medicine and her sleeves already pushed to the elbows. She sat on the other side of the bed and began wetting the cloth and laying it across Lily's forehead with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, in some other context he didn't know about yet. Lily looked at them both. "Am I going to be all right?" she said. "Yes," Elara said. Not a reassurance, a statement. She said it with the same plain certainty she applied to everything, and Caleb watched his daughter decide to believe it, and was grateful for that certainty in a way he couldn't have articulated. They gave her the fever drops in water and got another sip of plain water after, and Lily made the face children make with medicine and didn't complain about it, which was either stoicism or the fever already making her too tired to object. Elara kept changing the compress. Caleb sat with his hand over Lily's and talked. About nothing specific, just the sound of a voice being present, which was what you could offer at this particular juncture. The storm had not abated. If anything, it was louder now, and the house was colder than it had been 2 hours ago, despite the stoves. The temperature differential between the heated rooms and the exterior had increased enough that Caleb could feel it in the hallway, a cold current moving along the floor that hadn't been there before. He went down twice to add more wood, each time taking the stairs quickly and returning quickly, the way you leave a room where something is happening that needs monitoring. At midnight, the fever spiked. Lily's whole face went wrong. The color of it, the tension of it, the way she was working harder to breathe than she should have been for a simple cough. Caleb put his hand on her forehead and felt the difference from an hour ago, and felt the floor go soft the way it had gone soft in the hallway outside this woman's room 2 years ago on a Saturday night in February. He pulled his hand back. He stood up. He took 3 steps toward the door. "Caleb." Elara's voice was steady and direct. It wasn't loud. It was just exactly loud enough to reach him and stop him. "I need you in this room, not in the hallway." He turned. She was looking at him across the bed with clear eyes and an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely non-negotiable. She had the cold compress in her hands and a second cloth already in the water. "She needs both of us," she said. "Here. Now." Something was happening in his chest. A pressure. A flood of something old and specific and devastating. The memory of standing in a hallway listening to a doctor's careful voice. The way the floor had felt. The weight of Lily against his shoulder. The February that had taken everything and left him standing in pieces trying to figure out which part of himself to use first. He stood in the doorway of his daughter's room, and something in him tried to lock up the way it always locked up, tried to go to the place behind the glass where nothing could reach him, because behind the glass was the only place that was safe. "Hey," Elara's voice again. Still steady, still aimed directly at him. "She is not Margaret. This is not February. This is a fever, and we have medicine, and she is going to need her father to be in this room." He looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that said she understood exactly what she'd just said and exactly what it cost, and that she was saying it anyway because his daughter needed him functional, and this was not the moment to be tender about the method. He came back into the room. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He took Lily's hand. His daughter's fingers curled around his, automatic and trusting, the way a child holds on when they're frightened and know who to hold. And that simple motion, those small fingers tightening around his, cut through the glass and the grief and the January and the February and every protective layer he'd built and left him just a man sitting beside his sick child, fully present, with no barrier between him and the fear. "I'm here," he said, "to Lily." And it came out rough around the edges, but it came out. Lily's eyes opened. She looked at him. "Don't go," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Elara was already working, changing the compress again, preparing another dose of the fever drops measured carefully against the clock, because you couldn't give them too fast. Doing all of the practical things with quiet competence while Caleb held his daughter's hand and told her he wasn't going anywhere, and meant it in a way that had layers to it he'd sort through later. The fever peaked somewhere around 2 in the morning and began very slowly to yield. It didn't break cleanly. There was no dramatic moment, no clear before and after. It just began to pull back in increments, the way a tide turns, the temperature in Lily's skin going down in fractions over the next hour, while Elara kept the compresses going and Caleb kept his hand around his daughter's, and the storm continued its argument with the house. By 3 o'clock, Lily's breathing had eased. By 3:30, she'd fallen into something that looked more like sleep than the restless, working half-consciousness she'd been in for the last few hours. Her face lost its tight, laboring quality and went to the slack, soft expression of genuine rest. Caleb sat and watched her breathe for a long time. Elara leaned back in her chair on the other side of the bed and pushed the hair out of her face and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of someone who has been keyed up for several hours and is beginning to allow the tension to leave carefully, in stages. "She'll sleep now," Elara said quietly. "The fever's going the right direction." He nodded. He hadn't moved his hand from Lily's. "You should sleep too," Elara said. "One of us can watch her for a few hours." "I'm all right," he said. She looked at him across the bed. "You look like a man who just went somewhere very bad and came back," she said, which is what happened. He didn't argue with that. "I thought," he stopped, started again, "when her fever went that high. It was like—" "I know what it was like," she said, quietly, without flinching. He looked at her. "The way you pulled me back," he said. "The way you knew to say what you said." She was quiet for a moment. "When I was 17, my brother was very sick for about 2 weeks. My father couldn't be in the room with him. He'd stand in the doorway and go somewhere else in his head, and my mother would have to go get him and bring him back." She smoothed the cloth over Lily's forehead, checking the temperature by touch, automatic now. "I watched my mother do it 3 or 4 times over those weeks. I thought at the time that she was being hard on him. I understand now that she was just refusing to let him disappear when we needed him." Caleb absorbed this. "Your brother recovered." "He recovered." She looked at Lily. "So will she." The storm was still going, but something in it had shifted slightly. Not ending, but the particular quality of the wind had changed, moved from the sustained roar of its full strength to something with more variation in it, which in his experience meant the worst of it was past, even if the snow would continue for hours more. "Elara," he said. She looked at him. "What you said. About Margaret. About February." He didn't look away from her. "That took something. You needed to hear it." "I know. I'm not—" He stopped, looked for the words with the precision the moment deserved. "I'm saying thank you for understanding enough to say it." She held his eyes for a moment. Something in her expression was open in a way it wasn't usually, not unguarded exactly, but less managed. Like the hours of the night and the fear of the fever and the long conversation in the kitchen had worn down the careful administration of distance she maintained. "Don't thank me for that," she said. "Just be here. That's all I was asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been not here for 2 years." "I know." She knew too. Lily. "Yes." He looked at his daughter asleep between them. "I thought I was protecting her from something, from my own— I don't know. I thought if I didn't open anything up, it wouldn't hurt either of us." Elara looked at Lily too. "It hurt both of you anyway," she said. Not an accusation, just the same plain truth she always offered. "Yes," he said. "It did." Outside, the wind negotiated with itself. The stove ticked. The house held its heat around them. "I haven't been able to go into Margaret's room," he said. "Not since the week after the funeral. Lily knows not to ask about it. He paused. That's not protecting her. I know that now. I just don't know what else to call it. Surviving, Elara said. That's what else to call it. That's not nothing. He looked at her. But surviving's not the same as living, she said. And Lily needs you to live, not just stay alive in the same house. He turned that over. He was too tired to argue with it, and he didn't want to argue with it, because she was right, and he knew she was right, and the only thing that had ever prevented him from acknowledging it was that knowing it and doing something about it were separated by the kind of distance that can feel infinite when you're standing at one end of it alone. He was starting to think he might not be standing at one end of it alone anymore. That thought arrived quietly, without drama, while he was sitting in the dark beside his sleeping daughter in the middle of a blizzard with a woman he'd known for 6 weeks. It didn't frighten him the way he would have expected. It felt more like something that had been true for a little while and had finally gotten around to being named. He did not say any of this out loud. He sat with Lily's hand in his until 4 a.m, when Elara finally made him take the other chair and sleep in it for a few hours, which he did without much resistance, dropping into unconsciousness with his chin on his chest like a man whose body had overruled his intentions. Elara sat alone with Lily until dawn, changing the compress when it warmed, listening to the storm wind itself down outside, keeping the small particular watch that the night required. The storm had passed by morning. Caleb woke in the chair with a stiff neck and the gray early light showing through the gap in the curtain and the immediate understanding of where he was and why. He checked Lily first, sleeping still, face cooler, breathing right. He sat for a moment with his hand on her forehead to be certain, then straightened and looked around the room. Elara was gone. He heard sounds from downstairs, the stove, movement in the kitchen. He stood up, stretched out the stiffness in his back from the chair, and went to the window. The world outside had been rewritten overnight. Snow deep against the fence lines, the familiar contours of the yard transformed into something smoother and more severe, the barn a dark shape against the white. The sky was the particular clear, pale color it goes after a large storm, as though it's been emptied of everything and is starting over. He stood at the window for a moment. He felt the specific quality of a man who has been in a long fight and has reached the other side of it. Not triumphant exactly, more like empty in a clean way. Scored out. He thought about the night, the fever, the floor going soft beneath him, Elara's voice pulling him back from the place behind the glass, his daughter's fingers tightening around his in the dark. He thought about sitting across the kitchen table from Elara while the storm came in, and the things they'd said to each other that neither of them would have said in ordinary daylight with the day's work still ahead. He thought about the way she'd looked at him across Lily's bed, the part where her guard had come down, just a fraction, just enough. He went downstairs. Elara was at the stove with her back to the stairs. The kitchen smelled of coffee and something warmer underneath it. She'd already been outside, and her boots were wet near the door, which meant she'd checked on the barn, which meant she'd gone out into several feet of new snow before he'd woken up because the animals needed checking and she hadn't waited for him to do it. He stood in the kitchen doorway, not saying anything yet. She turned, registered him, and said, "Chickens are fine. Couldn't get to the cattle shelter, but the fence held overnight. She needs water and broth when she wakes up." He looked at her. She had a cut on the back of her left hand, small, from something sharp she'd encountered in the snow, and there was color in her face from the cold. "You went to the barn," he said. "You were asleep in a chair. The animals still needed checking." He didn't thank her. She would have told him not to. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the way people do when they've been through something together in the night and the morning after has a different quality to it than any morning before. "Elara," he said. She looked at him. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say. He wasn't a man who was practiced at saying the things that were most true to him. He'd spent too many years in the company of cattle and open land and the specific silence of a house with only grief in it. But he looked at her across the kitchen in the early light, with the cut on her hand and the color in her face and the steam rising from the coffee, and he felt something that was too large and too certain to leave unacknowledged. "I don't know what last night would have looked like without you," he said. "Either part of it." She looked at him steadily. She didn't deflect it or minimize it or tell him it was nothing. She just held it for a moment and said, "You did all right." "You pulled me back," he said. "When I was going somewhere, I've gone before and not come back from well." "I know where that goes," she said. "I've watched someone go there." A pause. "I wasn't going to let you." He stood with that. Then he said quietly, "Why?" She looked at him for a long moment, and the morning light was honest and even, and there was nowhere in the kitchen to look that wasn't direct. "You know why," she said. He did know. He'd known for a while. He'd been waiting, he thought, for the right moment, or for the fear to subside enough that the knowing could be acted upon. And he was beginning to think that the right moment and the absence of fear were not conditions that would ever arrive cleanly, and that some things required moving toward them without those conditions, simply because the alternative was to stay still and lose them. Lily called from upstairs. A small sound, not distressed, just announcing herself, the sound of a child waking up and registering she's not alone. They both heard it. Elara was already reaching for the broth she'd set on the back burner, the one she'd thought to put there before he'd even come downstairs. She poured it into a cup and handed it to him. "Go," she said. He took the cup. He looked at her one more second, at her face in the morning light, at the steadiness in her eyes, at the particular quality of a person who had been through enough to know what mattered and had decided somewhere along the line that she was going to be honest about it whether or not it was convenient. Then he went upstairs to his daughter. Lily was sitting up in bed with her hair disordered and her color better. Not well, but better. The specific look of a child on the far side of a bad night who is beginning to understand that she's going to be all right. She looked at him, then at the cup. "Is that the soup kind or the medicine kind?" she asked. "Soup kind," he said. She held out her hands for it. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched her drink it, and held the fact of her, alive, present, here, with both hands, the way you hold something you understand now that you cannot take for granted. "Papa," she said, between sips. "Yeah." "Were you scared last night?" He thought about honesty and what it was worth. "Yes," he said. She looked at her cup. "Me too." Then, "But Elara stayed." "She did," he said. Lily nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone filing away a confirmed fact. "She's the staying kind," she said. "I could tell from the beginning." He looked at his daughter. He didn't say anything. Lily finished the broth and handed him the cup and lay back against her pillow with the satisfied look of a child who has correctly identified something important and is content to leave it there. Downstairs, he could hear Elara moving through the kitchen. Outside, the snow lay clean and white and deep over everything, the storm gone, the world reconfigured, the morning sharp and clear and starting over. He sat with Lily until she slept again, and then he sat a little longer. Lily recovered in the way children recover, faster than seems reasonable, with a completeness that adults have generally lost the ability to manage. By the second day after the fever broke, she was sitting up asking for real food. By the third, she was back at the kitchen table with Elara, picking up the bread lesson exactly where they'd left it before the storm, as though the intervening night of high fever and fear had been a minor interruption rather than the event that had rearranged something fundamental in the adults around her. Caleb watched this resilience from a careful distance and found it both relieving and humbling. Children didn't require the long processing time that grief-trained adults did. They moved back toward life the way water moves back toward level. Not because they didn't understand what had happened, but because forward was simply the direction they were built to go. He spent the days after the storm digging out. There was no other word for the work. It was excavation, physical and sustained, clearing paths to the barn and the cattle shelter and the water troughs, breaking ice, moving snow that had drifted chest-high against the south fence line. He worked until dark each day, and came in stiff and cold, and was fed without ceremony and went to bed and did it again. The ranch needed the work, and the work needed him, and that was the arrangement, as it had always been. But something was different in the doing of it now. He couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't that the work was easier. It was the same brutal cold, the same resistant earth, the same ice that reformed on the troughs overnight, no matter how thoroughly you broke it. It was more that the coming back was different. Coming back to the house, coming in through the back door, hearing the specific sounds of the kitchen, Lily's voice, Elara's quieter one, the stove, the ordinary domestic sounds of a place that was being lived in by people who were paying attention to each other. That was different. That had weight and warmth and a quality of arrival that the house hadn't had in 2 years. He thought about what Lily had said. She's the staying kind. He thought about it more than was probably useful, standing at fence lines in the cold, chipping ice off water troughs. He thought about what Elara had said when he'd asked her why. You know why. And the way she'd held his gaze while she said it, and the way the morning light had been even and honest and had left nowhere to look that wasn't direct. He hadn't done anything with any of that yet. He was aware of this fact with a clarity that came from the specific cowardice of a man who has identified something true and is waiting for the courage to act on it to arrive fully formed, which it never does. It was Lily who forced the timeline. 10 days after the fever, on a Friday morning in late December, she came down to breakfast with her hair combed and her good boots on and announced that she wanted to go to town. Caleb looked up from his coffee. What for? I want to get ribbon, she said, for Elara's Christmas. This was the first Caleb had heard of Christmas being planned as an event at the ranch, and he looked briefly at Elara, who looked briefly back at him with an expression that said she hadn't planned it either, that this was Lily operating on her own initiative. Ribbon, he said. She mended my blue dress, Lily said, sitting down and pulling the bread toward her with the confidence of a child who has decided the matter is settled. And she fixed my boots so they don't let in water. And she taught me to make bread. She looked at him with her mother's gray eyes. She should have a proper Christmas present, and I want ribbon, red ribbon. Caleb set down his coffee. All right, he said. We'll go this afternoon. Elara said nothing. She was at the counter and had her back to them, but he could see from the set of her shoulders that she was moved by this in some way she was choosing not to display, which was entirely consistent with how she managed most things that landed near her heart. They drove to town after midday dinner, Caleb and Lily, with the understanding that the ribbon was to be a surprise, which meant Elara stayed at the ranch and made a list of things they could pick up from Harlan's while they were there. A practical woman. Even in the middle of being given a Christmas present, she managed to make the trip useful. Coldwater Flats had not changed since the last time he'd come in for supplies, which was its nature. Small towns changed slowly, if at all, and in winter they pulled in further on themselves, the population concentrated near the stoves and the supply lines, everyone waiting for the cold to relent and life to expand again. The main street had been partially cleared of snow, enough for wagons to pass, and there were a few people moving between the buildings with the purposeful economy of people who had somewhere warm to be. He tied the horse in front of Harlan's and lifted Lily down, and she went directly to the display of dry goods near the window with the focused intent of a person who has known exactly what they want since before they left the house. They were in the middle of assessing the ribbon options. Lily had opinions about width as well as color, which Caleb had not anticipated, when the door opened and Diane Osgood came in with Ruth Hensley behind her, stamping snow off their boots in the particular emphatic way of women who have been cold and are aggrieved about it. They saw Caleb. They saw Lily. There was a beat of the kind that happens in small towns when people who have been talking about each other privately suddenly find themselves in the same room. Diane Osgood recovered first. She was a composed woman, the banker's wife, practiced at social management. She looked at Lily with the careful assessment of someone updating an internal record. Lily had her back to them, still holding a length of red ribbon to the light with the gravity of an assessor. Her dress was clean, her hair was neatly braided and pinned, her boots were the good ones, recently resoled, and her coat was well fitted and properly buttoned. She looked, in short, like a child who was being looked after. Caleb, Diane Osgood said, in the cautious tone of someone who is revising a position and wants him to know it without having to say it directly. And Lily, my goodness, don't you look well? Lily turned and looked at Diane Osgood with the clear, unimpressed appraisal that 7-year-olds deploy when they have not forgotten an earlier offense, even if they lack the vocabulary to name it. Thank you, Lily said, politely, with exactly the warmth of a child who has learned politeness as a skill rather than a reflex. Ruth Hensley was doing something with her face that suggested she was rearranging her earlier opinions in real time and finding the process mildly uncomfortable. She's grown, she said, which was the kind of thing people say when what they really mean is something they're not prepared to say. Caleb bought the ribbon, the full width, in the good red, which Lily had correctly identified as superior to the thinner variety, and the items on Elara's list, and paid without particular conversation, because he had found over recent weeks that he'd lost patience for conversations that lived on the surface of things when he'd been spending his evenings in the company of a person who didn't bother with the surface if she could avoid it. He was putting the last package in the wagon when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find not Diane Osgood, but Warren Osgood himself, come out of the bank in his good coat with a look that was more complicated than his wife's. "Voss," he said. "Osgood." Caleb kept his hands on the wagon. The banker looked at Lily, who was already up on the seat waiting, and then back at Caleb with an expression that contained several things stacked on each other. The management instinct, the social calculus, but also something underneath that might have been genuine discomfort with himself, which Caleb hadn't expected. "The girl looks well," Osgood said. "She is." A pause. The wind moved between them, cold and indifferent to whatever was happening socially. Osgood put his hands in his coat pockets. "I may have spoken out of turn," he said. "A few weeks back, about the woman at your ranch." Caleb looked at him. "Diane and I have been talking about it," Osgood continued, "and I think my concerns were perhaps more about appearances than about the actual situation." It was the closest Warren Osgood was going to get to an apology, and Caleb understood that. He looked at the man for a moment, not warmly, not coldly, just honestly. "Appreciate you saying so," he said. He got up on the wagon and drove home. Christmas at the Voss ranch was not what Caleb had expected, which was partly because he hadn't expected much, and partly because what it turned out to be was so plain and specific and right that he couldn't have anticipated it even if he'd tried. Elara made a tree from pine branches wired together because there were no full trees near enough to cut, and Lily decorated it with scraps of colored cloth and a string of dried berries that she'd spent 2 afternoons working on at the kitchen table. The result was not a beautiful tree in any conventional sense, but it was clearly a tree that meant something, and that was better. Lily gave Elara the red ribbon, wrapped in brown paper with a knot tied the way Elara had taught her. Elara unwrapped it slowly, not quickly the way you do when you're performing gratitude, but the way you do when you actually want to look at the thing, and she held the ribbon between her hands for a moment before she said anything. "It's exactly right," she said. Lily sat very straight, pleased with herself in the private way she had that didn't overflow into showing off. "I picked the wide kind," she said. "It's better." "It is," Elara agreed. Caleb gave Lily a new pair of boots, proper ones, ordered from Billings at some expense, which he'd arranged weeks back during one of his supply trips and had been keeping in the barn under a feed sack. She pulled them on immediately and walked around the kitchen in them for 10 minutes, testing their realness. He didn't have a gift for Elara. He hadn't planned for Christmas the way Lily apparently had, and the oversight sat with him uncomfortably through the morning, a small persistent fault. After dinner, while Lily was occupied with her boots and a picture book she'd gotten in the mail from Doris Pemberton, he went to the front room and stood at the desk for a while, and then he went upstairs. He stood in front of Margaret's door for a long time. The handle was the same handle it had always been, iron, worn smooth at the grip. He'd passed this door 1,000 times in 2 years and kept walking. He'd never specifically decided not to go in. He'd just never turned the handle. He turned it now. The room smelled of thyme and the faintest remaining thread of lavender, which was not really lavender anymore, but was the memory of it, embedded in the fabric of things. It was cold. He hadn't kept a fire going in this room, and it had taken the temperature of the outside rather than the inside. The furniture was the same. The quilt on the bed was the one Margaret had made the first winter they were married, the blue and white one, and it lay exactly as it had been left, which meant he was looking at the last way Margaret's hands had arranged it. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked in. He went to the dresser. The tortoiseshell pins were in a small dish near the mirror, the set Lily had described to Elara on the first night. He stood looking at them for a moment, then picked them up. They were lighter than he remembered, which surprised him, though he couldn't say why he expected them to be heavy. Beside the dish was Margaret's ring. She'd taken it off the week she was sick. Her hands had swollen slightly, and the ring had been uncomfortable, and she'd put it in the dish, meaning to put it back when she felt better. She hadn't felt better. He'd seen it there on the day after the funeral and hadn't been able to touch it, and had closed the door and not opened it again. He stood looking at the ring for a long time. He thought about what it meant to take it, what it meant to leave it. He thought about Margaret, really thought about her, not the way he usually did, behind glass, at a managed remove, but directly, the way she deserved. He thought about the particular quality of her laugh, which had surprised people who didn't know her because it was louder than they expected. He thought about her specific competence with difficult things, the way she handled what was hard without theater, and then recognized the same quality in Elara and understood that his recognition had not been accidental. He thought about what Margaret would have said about this situation. He thought he knew. He picked up the ring. He put it in his shirt pocket next to his chest. He closed the dresser drawer and stood for one more moment in the room, and then he left it, leaving the door open behind him for the first time in 2 years, so the room could have some of the house's warmth. He didn't say anything to Elara that day. The ring stayed in his pocket through Christmas afternoon, and through supper, and through the quiet evening that followed. He needed to find the right way to approach it, not the right words exactly, but the right quality of honesty, the kind that didn't make the thing into a performance. The days between Christmas and New Year's had their own kind of quiet. The cold continued, but the big storms held off, and the work was its regular winter weight, manageable and known. Lily went back to her lessons and her barn visiting and her bread practice. The ranch ran. Wade's third letter arrived on the 28th. Caleb saw the handwriting on the envelope and felt something harden in his jaw. He opened it at the desk in the front room, read it standing up, and did not put it in the stove. This letter was different from the others. Wade had clearly acted. He'd spoken to someone in the county seat, a lawyer, by the phrasing, about the legal question of guardianship and whether the current situation at the ranch could be challenged on grounds of moral unsuitability. The lawyer had apparently told him something useful, because Wade's tone had shifted from advisory to something with more confidence behind it. He wanted to come to Coldwater Flats in January to discuss the matter. He expected Caleb to give the woman her wages and send her on, and if Caleb wasn't willing to do that voluntarily, Wade was prepared to make a formal inquiry to the county regarding Lily's welfare. Caleb put the letter on the desk. He sat in the chair across from it and looked at it for a long time with his hands on his knees. He went through everything Wade could actually do, legally and practically, with the same analytical precision he'd applied the first time this threat had been made. He was calmer about it now than he'd been then, which surprised him a little until he understood why. The first time, the threat had landed in uncertain ground, in the soft place where he didn't yet know what he was doing or why. Now the ground was less uncertain. He knew what he was doing. He knew why. That night, after Lily was in bed, he sat down across from Elara at the kitchen table and put Wade's letter between them without comment and let her read it. She read it twice. Her face didn't change while she read, which he had come to understand was not the same as nothing happening. It was the face of someone managing their response carefully because what they were actually feeling was stronger than what they wanted to show. She put it down. She looked at the table for a moment, not at him. "He's made contact with a lawyer," she said. "Yes." "Can he do anything? Actually do anything?" "I don't know. Probably not without a stronger case than he has." He kept his voice even. "But the process itself, an inquiry, a formal review, that has effects regardless of the outcome. Lily's name in county records associated with a welfare inquiry." Elara looked at the letter again. Then she looked at him. "I should probably go," she said. Something in his chest went absolutely still. "No," he said. She looked at him steadily. "If my being here is—" "No," he said again, and the word came out the same way it had the first time she'd asked him that, with the same force and the same absence of hesitation, but this time he didn't stop there. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at her directly. "I'm not sending you away because my brother hired a lawyer. That's not how this is going to go." She held his eyes. "You'd be risking? I know what I'd be risking. I've thought about it." He paused, and then did the thing he'd been building toward for weeks, without knowing that was what he was building toward. "I've thought about it, and the only thing I'm not willing to risk is what's already here. What Lily has. What, he stopped, reorganized. What I have. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Elara was looking at him with an expression that was open and careful at the same time, the way you look at something you want and aren't certain yet that you're allowed to want. Caleb, she said quietly. Let me say it, he said. I'm not practiced at it, but let me say it. He looked at her. You came here with a bag and 2 years of starting over behind you, and you walked into this house and you looked at what was broken in it, not just the dirty floors and the cold stove, and you started working on it without being asked and without making anyone feel managed or pitied. You brought Lily back. His voice was level, but it was costing him. You brought me back. The night of the fever, when I was going somewhere I've been before and you pulled me out of it. I've been thinking about that since. About what that means. About what kind of person does that. She was quiet. I'm not asking you to stay as a housekeeper, he said. I'm asking you to stay because this is where you belong, if you want it to be. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, not empty, but full, the way silence is when it's actually containing something. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he said, when she didn't speak. I'm not putting a clock on it. I'm just saying the thing that's been true for a while and needed saying. Elara looked at her hands on the table for a moment. Then she looked up at him. I have not, she said, slowly and precisely, let myself want anything in 2 years. Because wanting things required trusting the future, and I wasn't... She stopped, started again. I'm not afraid of the same things I was afraid of before, but I'm careful for reasons. You understand that? I do, he said. And I have not made easy decisions in my life, and every hard one has cost me something, and I have been wrong before about what I was walking toward. She looked at him. So I need you to understand that if I say yes to this, I'm not saying it lightly. I'm not saying it because I have nowhere else to go. I have places I can go. She said this plainly, without defensiveness, just as a fact she needed him to have. I'm saying it, if I say it, because it's what I actually want. I understand that, he said. I'm counting on it. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the stove made a small sound. Somewhere upstairs the house settled, the way old houses do, a small creak of timber finding its position in the cold. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right. I'm not leaving, she said. That's what I'm saying, whatever your brother does. I'm not leaving. He reached into his shirt pocket. He put the ring on the table between them, Margaret's ring, the one he'd picked up from the dish in the cold room with the lavender memory. And he looked at it and then looked at her. Not tonight, he said. This isn't the moment for this. Not yet. But I want you to know I went into her room today, for the first time. And I picked this up. He kept his hand near it but didn't push it toward her. Not because she's gone. Because the room shouldn't be closed anymore, and neither should I. Elara looked at the ring. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him, and her eyes were not quite clear, and she didn't pretend they were. That took something, she said, his own words back to him from the night of the fever. Yes, he said. She reached out and put her hand over his hand, not the ring, his hand, briefly, just a moment, warm and deliberate. Then she withdrew it and looked at the table, and there was something in the set of her face that was not composed in the managed way she usually was, but composed in the way that comes after something releases. He put the ring back in his pocket. They sat for a little while longer in the kitchen, not saying much, the way people can sit when something has been said that doesn't need following with anything. What? He wrote to Wade the next morning. The letter took him the better part of an hour and was the longest he'd written to his brother in years. He said that Wade's inquiry to the county would find nothing because there was nothing to find. The arrangement at the ranch was lawful, appropriate, and had been in every practical sense transformative for Lily, which Wade would understand if he came and looked rather than if he sent letters. He said that he had spoken to Elara Whitmore about his intentions, and that she had, in terms that left no ambiguity, indicated hers. He said that if Wade still wanted to come to Coldwater Flats in January, he was welcome, but that the purpose of the visit would be to meet the woman who was going to be part of this family, not to negotiate her departure. He sealed it and took it to town himself that same afternoon. He was coming out of the post office when he nearly walked directly into Ruth Hensley on the boardwalk. She caught herself. He caught himself. And they stood for a moment in the particular awkwardness of two people who have things between them that haven't been addressed. Ruth Hensley was not a bad woman. He understood that, even through his irritation. She was a woman shaped by a town that ran on reputation and appearance, doing the accounting that kind of town required, and she'd misjudged the ledger where Lily was concerned because she'd been looking at the surface of things. "Mr. Voss," she said, more carefully than usual. "Mrs. Hensley." She looked at him for a moment. "I understand your daughter has been under the weather." "She's recovered, fully." "I'm glad to hear it." A pause that was doing visible work. Several of us have been thinking. There's to be a gathering at the church hall on Saturday. Families, we thought, if you and your daughter and your housekeeper might like to come. He heard the hesitation around the word housekeeper. He heard what it was covering for and what it was trying to extend, imperfectly and with some difficulty, in the way that towns extend things when they've recalculated. "I'll mention it to them," he said. Ruth Hensley nodded with what appeared to be genuine relief, as though she'd prepared for a harder answer. "Good. That's good, then." He walked back to the wagon. He thought about the word housekeeper in her mouth, and how it had sounded, and how it would eventually stop being what people called Elara, and how towns revised themselves the same way people did, slowly, with some resistance, and only when the evidence accumulated past the point of comfortable ignoring. He drove back to the ranch with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has done several things he'd been putting off doing, and found that doing them had been better than not doing them, which was always true and never stopped being a surprise. He told Elara about the gathering at the hall. She was mending. She was always mending something. It was the most constant thing about her. And she looked up from it and considered the invitation in her careful way. "Ruth Hensley, specifically," she said. "Specifically." She looked at her mending. "She was the one in Harlan's, the first time you brought Lily to town." He'd told her about that, late one night when they'd been talking. He was mildly surprised she'd kept track. "Yes." Elara was quiet for a moment. "What does Lily want to do?" He hadn't asked Lily yet. He went and asked her. Lily thought about it with the seriousness she applied to significant questions. "Will there be other children?" she said. "Probably." She thought about this more. "All right," she decided, "but Elara has to come." "That's the plan," he said. Lily returned to her book, satisfied. He went back to the kitchen and told Elara. She listened and nodded and went back to the mending. "All right," she said. He sat down across from her. He watched her work for a moment, the needle moving through the fabric, the slight furrow between her brows, the particular concentrated quality she brought to any task she took on. He thought about all the things she'd fixed since she came here, the measurable ones, the clothes, the house, the stove, the porch board she'd asked him to nail back down the second week because she'd nearly tripped on it twice. And the other ones, the ones that didn't show on surfaces. "Elara," he said. She looked up. "When I walk into that hall on Saturday," he said, "I'm not walking in with my housekeeper." She looked at him. The needle stopped. "I'll tell them whatever needs to be said," he said, "about what you are, about what this is." He paused. "But I'm not letting Ruth Hensley or Warren Osgood or anyone in that town keep calling you something that doesn't account for what you actually are to this family." The kitchen was very still. Elara looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her face that she wasn't bothering to manage. The specific look of someone who has been bracing for a long time and is trying to understand that they don't have to brace anymore. "You're going to cause a scene," she said. "Probably," he said. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but what lived in the neighborhood of one. "All right," she said quietly. He nodded. She went back to the mending. He sat across from her in the kitchen while the winter light came through the window and the stove held its warmth, and upstairs Lily's footsteps moved across the floor in the particular pattern of a child doing something she thought she wasn't being observed doing, and the ranch held its familiar sounds around them, and Caleb Voss felt, for the first time in 2 years, like a man who was approximately where he was supposed to be. Saturday arrived the way significant days often do. With no particular announcement, just the ordinary cold morning light, and the smell of coffee and Lily, already awake and dressed before Caleb came downstairs, standing in the kitchen in her new boots, with her hair braided and her face carrying the careful, composed expression of a child who has decided that today matters and is not going to let nerves show about it. Elara was at the stove. She had the red ribbon in her hair, Lily's Christmas gift, wound into the knot at the back of her head with the precision of someone who'd practiced it. She hadn't mentioned it. Lily saw it and said nothing either, just sat down at the table with the private satisfaction of someone whose gift has been used in exactly the right way. Caleb drank his coffee and looked at the two of them in his kitchen and thought about the hall in town and what he'd told Elara he was going to do, and felt the particular weight of a thing you've said out loud that is now waiting to be done. He was not a man who liked scenes. He'd spent most of his life in the company of land and cattle and the specific quiet of work that asked nothing of him socially. He was not practiced at standing up in rooms full of people and declaring things. The thought of it produced a specific discomfort that he recognized as the kind worth pushing through rather than the kind worth listening to. They drove to town in the early afternoon. The church hall was not large, but it was full. Coldwater Flats gathered for these things with the completeness of a place that didn't have many opportunities to gather. And the room was warm with wood stove heat and the noise of children and the lower current of adult conversation that flows beneath. Caleb handed the wagon reins to the boy out front and helped Lily down and then Elara, and they walked in together through the door, the three of them, without particular ceremony. The room noticed. He felt it before he saw it, the slight shift in the sound, the quality of attention redirecting. He knew what they were looking at. He'd known they would look. Lily felt it too. He saw her shoulders go up slightly, the old defensive posture, the way she used to hold herself in Harlan's when she was bracing for something. Then, almost immediately, he felt her hand find his. He held it. They had not made it 10 feet into the room when Diane Osgood appeared. Not antagonistically, more in the manner of a woman who has thought about this moment and prepared for it and chosen the approach that offered her the most social grace. She looked at Lily with genuine warmth that had not been there before. "Lily," she said, "don't you look wonderful? Are those new boots?" Lily looked at her. "Yes," she said. "My father got them from Billings." Diane Osgood looked at Caleb. She looked at Elara, and there was a beat, a recalibration, visible and honest. And then she said, "Miss Whitmore, I don't believe we've properly met. I'm Diane Osgood." Elara looked at her with the calm, level eyes she brought to everything. "I know who you are," she said. "Not unkindly, just plainly." Another beat. Then Diane Osgood said, with the particular courage of someone choosing to do the harder thing, "I hope you'll find it a pleasant afternoon. We're glad you came." It was not a full accounting. It was not an apology of the kind that would have been satisfying to demand, but it was something. A door opening from the other side, however narrowly, and Elara gave it the same weight it deserved. She nodded, once, and said, "Thank you," and moved on into the room. Ruth Hensley was near the food table. She saw them come in and made a decision that Caleb watched her make, something visibly resolved in her face, and she came over with a plate of biscuits and offered them to Lily first. And when Lily took one and said thank you with impeccable politeness, Ruth Hensley looked at Caleb and said, "She's a credit to you, to both of you." And the second part of the sentence cost her something, and she said it anyway. He gave her that. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. Lily drifted towards the other children, tentatively at first, then with more ease as a girl about her age with red hair started asking about her boots. And the conversation opened the way children's conversations do, quickly and without the overhead that adults require. Caleb watched his daughter from across the room and felt the specific quality of relief that comes when you see a child find footing in a social situation that has not always been kind to her. He was watching Lily when Warren Osgood came to stand beside him. The banker did not waste time on preamble. "Your brother wrote to me," he said quietly. Caleb looked at him. "He asked if I would look into the situation at your ranch. Formally." Osgood kept his eyes forward, looking at the room rather than at Caleb, which was either discomfort or tact. I wrote back and told him I didn't see any grounds for an inquiry and that I wouldn't be pursuing the matter. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When did you write that? Last week. He thought about Wade's most recent letter, the one with the lawyer's confidence behind it. He thought about what that letter would look like if Osgood had already declined to cooperate. He thought about how much of Wade's leverage had been dependent on Osgood's participation and how the removal of that participation changed the structure of what his brother could actually threaten. I appreciate it, he said. Osgood finally looked at him. I should have done it the first time he wrote, he said, which was, from Warren Osgood, the fullest accounting Caleb was going to receive, and he accepted it in the spirit it was offered. The afternoon moved the way those gatherings do, in currents, people collecting and dispersing, conversations overlapping, children running patterns between the adults' legs with the autonomous energy of children who have been inside too long and are using the available space thoroughly. Elara had found a quiet corner with two women Caleb didn't know well, who turned out to be the wives of the newer ranching families east of town, and she was talking to them in the unhurried way she talked to people when she wasn't being assessed, when the conversation was just a conversation. He stood across the room and watched her and thought, there she is. That's simple, not a housekeeper, not a stranger, not a practical arrangement. There she is. He crossed the room. He was aware of the room noting this too. He was aware of the exact moment when the general attention of the hall, the peripheral, social, small-town awareness that monitors movement and proximity, registered that Caleb Voss was crossing the room to stand beside the woman he'd brought, and that he was standing beside her with the specific posture of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. Ruth Hensley noticed. Diane Osgood noticed. Half a dozen others noticed in the way that people notice things in a room of 60 people with few walls and good sight lines. He didn't care about any of that. He was done caring about it, and had been done for a while, and the only thing that had been required was the right moment to show it clearly. Elara looked at him when he came to stand beside her. She read something in his face. She was always reading something in his face with more accuracy than most people managed, and what she found there made something in her expression settle, the last tension of the afternoon releasing. One of the women she'd been talking to, the one named Clara Briggs, looked between them with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who has not been part of the politics. "Is this your husband?" she asked Elara. The word landed in the air between them. Elara looked at Caleb. The pause was a fraction of a second. "Not yet," Caleb said. Clara Briggs smiled broadly. Elara's eyes held his for a moment, and then she turned back to the conversation, but the color in her face had changed slightly, and she did not tell him not yet was presumptuous, which told him everything. Across the room, Lily had been absorbed fully into the group of children and was explaining something with her hands in the particular emphatic way she had inherited from her mother. And the red-haired girl was listening with genuine attention, and Lily looked like a child at a party, a regular child at a party, belonging to it without effort. Caleb stood beside Elara and let the afternoon run its course. Wade came in the second week of January. He arrived on the eastbound stage looking road-worn and carrying the specific energy of a man who has rehearsed several conversations and is prepared to have whichever one is necessary. He was 50, broader than Caleb, with their father's jaw and their father's way of standing like he was prepared to hold ground. Caleb met him at the depot, alone. They shook hands the way brothers who have been in long disagreement shake hands, correctly, without warmth, covering the distance with form. Wade looked at him, and whatever he saw made him recalibrate before he'd said a word. "You look different," Wade said. "Come out to the ranch," Caleb said. "We'll talk there." The drive out was quiet. Wade looked at the land, their father's land, the land they'd disagreed about for years, and didn't say what he was thinking, which was unusual enough that Caleb noted it. Elara had known Wade was coming. She'd made no particular accommodation and no particular effort to be elsewhere. When they came in, she was at the stove and she turned and looked at Wade Voss with the direct, composed gaze she brought to things she'd already thought through. "Mr. Voss," she said. Not the name she used for Caleb. The other one. Wade looked at her. He looked at the kitchen. The order of it, the warmth, the smell of something cooking, the child-sized coat on the hook by the door. He looked at the bread rising on the counter and the mended curtains at the window, and the dish rack where everything had a place. He took inventory with the eyes of a man who had built an argument on premises that were dissolving under actual observation. Lily came downstairs and stopped on the bottom step when she saw the stranger. "This is your Uncle Wade," Caleb said. "He lives in Cheyenne." Lily looked at her uncle with the measuring appraisal she'd been deploying since the church hall gathering with increasing accuracy. "You wrote the letters," she said. Wade looked at the child. He looked at her. Really looked, the way the town had looked at the gathering and updated what they were seeing. She was not the child of those letters. She was not a neglected, troubled case in need of intervention. She was a small, clear-eyed girl in clean clothes with braided hair who had just identified him correctly and was not intimidated. "I did," he said. "Why?" she said. Wade was quiet for a moment. "I was worried about you," he said, which was probably true under everything else. Lily considered this. "You didn't need to be," she said, and went to Elara. Caleb watched his brother watch this. Lily going to Elara the way she went, with the ease of a child moving toward a reliable presence, and Elara putting a hand briefly on her shoulder without looking up from the stove, automatic and unperformed, the gesture of someone who had been doing it long enough that it had stopped being a gesture and become a habit. He took Wade to the front room. They sat across from each other the way they always had in disputes. Not hostile exactly, but positioned. Wade was quiet for a long time, which Caleb let him have. "I expected worse," Wade finally said. He meant the house, the situation, Elara, all of it. "I know you did." Wade searched for the word. "She's not what I thought." "What did you think?" His brother looked at the window. "I thought you'd been careless, that you were too deep in it to see clearly." "And now?" Wade looked at him. Something in his brother's face was less armored than usual, not soft. Wade Voss was not a soft man, but honest in the specific way that men are honest when they've been wrong and know it and are in the process of deciding to say so. "I was wrong about the careless part," he said. "You see her clearly enough." "Yes," Caleb said. "I do." A silence. Wade looked at his hands. "The custody question. I was using it as a lever. You know that." "I know that." "It was a bad thing to threaten," Wade said. She's well. Whatever I thought about the situation, she's well, and I can see that." He paused. "I'm saying I'm not going to pursue it." "I know," Caleb said. "Osgood already told me you dropped it." Wade looked mildly chagrined. "Then you knew before I got here." "I knew before you got here." His brother was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted, some last resistance resolving, and he said with difficulty but genuinely, "I should have come and looked first, instead of writing." "Yes," Caleb said, "you should have." They sat in the undecorated truth of that for a moment. Then Caleb said, "Stay for supper." Wade looked at him. "Stay for supper," Caleb said again. "Meet her properly. Meet Lily. Then go back to Cheyenne and tell whoever asked that the situation at the Voss Ranch is not a situation." Wade stayed for supper. It was not a comfortable meal in the easy, familiar sense. There was too much history in the room for easy, and Wade was not a man who relaxed quickly in circumstances he'd misjudged. But it was honest. Lily asked him questions about Cheyenne with the unsentimental directness she brought to gathering information. Elara fed everyone and participated in the conversation without performing anything, and what she was, competent, clear, settled in the house the way someone is settled when they belong to it, was visible enough that no letter could have conveyed it and no argument could have manufactured it. Wade left the next morning. At the door, he looked at Caleb and then at Elara and said, "Take care of them." It took Caleb a moment to understand that the them in that sentence included him, Swab. He gave Elara the ring on a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday. Not the first of anything, not an anniversary of anything. Just a Tuesday in February, the month he'd dreaded for 2 years. The month he'd spent the last weeks walking back into instead of away from. He'd opened Margaret's room and aired it out and put fresh wood in the small stove. Not to use it as a room yet, but to stop treating it like a wound. The door stayed open. The lavender memory had mostly gone now. replaced by the ordinary cold smell of an unoccupied room in winter, which was its own kind of release. He found Elara in the barn. She was there because the mare had a shoe coming loose, and she'd gone to look at it and was holding the horse's leg up with the particular competent grip of someone who grew up around animals, even if not on a ranch. She looked up when he came in. "Left rear," she said. "She needs the farrier." "I'll get him tomorrow," he said. He stood in the barn with her and the horse and the smell of hay and cold leather, and he took the ring out of his shirt pocket where he'd been carrying it for weeks and held it out. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to replace anything," he said, "or to be replaced by anything. That's not what this is." He kept his voice level and plain, the way she'd always spoken truth to him. "I'm asking if you want to build something, with me, with Lily, on this land, even knowing it's already got history on it, and winters that are trying to kill you, and a man who took 2 years too long to figure out how to be present in his own life." She stood with the horse's legs still held up in her hands, which should have been absurd and somehow wasn't. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger there in the barn, with the mare as the only witness, and the cold air around them and the particular unpolished reality of two people who had both been through enough to know that the good things rarely arrive in the right setting. They arrive in the barn, on a Tuesday, when one of you is holding up a horse's leg and neither of you is prepared, which is the only way anything real ever actually happens. She looked at the ring on her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not easy to live with." "I know that," he said. "I have opinions about how things should be done, and I don't always keep them to myself. I've noticed. And I'm not going to stop being who I am because I'm someone's wife." "I'd consider it a significant failure on my part if you did," he said. She looked at him for a beat. Then she set the mare's leg down carefully and straightened and stood in front of him with the ring on her hand and her chin level and her eyes clear, and she said, "All right, Caleb Voss." He almost smiled. "All right, Elara Whitmore." They were married in March, in the county seat, with Lily as the only witness and wearing her good boots and her serious expression. She carried a bunch of dried wildflowers that Elara had kept from the autumn, tied with red ribbon. Afterward, they ate lunch at the only restaurant in town that had a tablecloth, and Lily ordered pie and asked if she could call Elara Mama. And Elara looked at the table for a moment and then at Lily and said yes, if she wanted to, and Lily said she did, and that was that. They drove home in the early afternoon. The land was still winter brown, but there was something at the edges of it, a quality of light, a faint softening in the ground, that said the season was turning. It would be weeks yet. Montana didn't turn quickly, and the cold would come back several more times before it finished, and there would be hard springs and brutal summers and winters that tested everything you'd built. That was the nature of the place. Lily fell asleep against Elara's shoulder on the drive home, her flowers still in her lap, her boots on the floor of the wagon. Elara didn't move to accommodate her or hold herself rigid about it. She just let Lily sleep against her and looked at the road ahead. Caleb drove. The ranch came into view with the late afternoon light on it, the barn and the house and the fences he'd mended, and the land his grandfather had worked and his father after him and himself for going on 12 years now. He'd spent 2 of those years keeping the body of the place running while its soul went dark. He understood, looking at it now, that a place is not saved by the maintenance of it. It's saved by the living that happens inside it. There are people who will tell you that grief ends. It doesn't. Not fully, not cleanly, not in the way that would make the story neater. What changes is the relationship to it. You stop fighting it and you stop hiding from it, and you find, eventually, that you can carry it and still move forward, and that moving forward is not a betrayal of what you lost, but the only honest response to the fact that you are still here and the world is still asking things of you. Caleb Voss had lost his wife and nearly lost his daughter, and had spent 2 years losing himself in the specific, patient way of a man who believes that staying alive and living are the same thing. They are not the same thing. He knew that now. He'd needed someone to come in with a single bag and a clear pair of eyes to show him the difference, and he'd needed to be broken open by a blizzard and a child's fever and a brother's threat before he understood that the opening was what he'd actually needed all along. Elara Whitmore had spent 2 years putting distance between herself and what had been done to her, and she'd been right to run, And she'd been right to be careful. And she'd been right to tell him plainly that she wasn't staying because she had nowhere else to go. The bravest thing a person can do after being convinced their own judgment can't be trusted is to trust it again. Slowly, with evidence, without pretending the past didn't happen. She'd done that. She hadn't done it perfectly. She'd done it honestly, which is harder. Lily would grow up on this land and carry all of it. The loss and the cold and the years her father was behind glass, and the winter a woman arrived with a single bag and started fixing things that hadn't been fixed, and the night of the blizzard and the fever and what came after. She would grow up knowing that families are not only the ones you're born into, that a home is not the building but the attention paid inside it, that the people who stay, who choose to stay, who come back when they could leave, who sit up through the fever and say your name in the dark so you know you're not alone, those are the ones that matter. The wagon went through the gate. The ranch held its ground around them, solid and imperfect in theirs. Lily slept on.